Hey everyone, Mrs. Lewis here. Just wanted to start our first official classroom novel being taught virtually. So typically when we start The Adventures of Ulysses, we would have walked down to the library and got our copies of the book. It would have either looked like this one or the one with the blue cover that a lot of you guys are checking out virtually right now. They are the same text. You will notice they have slightly different page numbers. So when you get into the ship's log packet, if you notice that the vocabulary has two different page numbers, one page number matches this version, the other matches the blue book cover. So you'll be able to figure that out once you get yours checked out. We are reading The Adventures of Ulysses by Bernard Evslin, and it is an abridged version of the actual Odyssey by Homer. So one of the first things I always read to you guys is a little note that they have at the beginning of this particular version. It is the biographical note. So I will go ahead and just read it really fast to you guys because it's not in the blue version that you guys are checking out. It says, Homer, perhaps the most famous and widely read Greek poet of any age, Homer is believed to have composed his epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, between 800 and 700 BCE. These poems tell the story of the Trojan War, an event that may have occurred in the mid-1200s BCE, and the events that followed as seen through the imagination of the blind poet. The Adventures of Ulysses by Bernard Evslin is a modern retelling of Homer's second poem, the Odyssey, which is the story of the long voyage of Odysseus, another name for Ulysses. So in our version, our main character is going to be called Ulysses. This is the Latin version of his name. The actual Greek version of his name is Odysseus. So same guy, two different names. So here it is, the prologue to The Adventures of Ulysses. The Adventures of Ulysses begin many years before the opening of this book. He was the master strategist of the Greek forces in their war against Troy, the war that started with an apple, ended with a horse, and was fought by 1,000 kings for the love of a single woman. It left an ancient city in flames that still burn in man's imagination after 3,000 years. The war started when Peleus, mightiest hero of his time, was married to Thetis, the most beautiful naiad that ever sported among the waves, or fled the embrace of Poseidon. It was a magnificent wedding, attended by all the gods on Olympus. Unfortunately, however, Thetis had neglected to send an invitation to Eris, lady of discord, and the sister to the god of war. It was an omission that was to cost a river of blood. For Eris came without an invitation and threw upon the banquet table a golden apple inscribed to the fairest. Mischievous words. The apple was claimed immediately by Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. The feud between the three goddesses waxed so bitter that no god dared attempt mediation, but passed the judgment on to Paris, a shepherd boy of Troy, the son of King Priam, whose royal birth had been kept a secret. Paris was said to be the most beautiful of all the lads of the inner sea. Bribes came his way immediately. Hera offered him power, promising to make him the mightiest king the world had ever seen. Athena offered him wisdom, all the lore of heaven and earth, and all the lore beyond death too, all that had been written and spoken, and also that too secret to be uttered, would be his. Aphrodite said little. She came close to him and whispered in his ear. When she had finished whispering, he gave her the apple. She smiled and kissed him. Hera and Athena flew off, screaming their rage. What the goddess Aphrodite had whispered to Paris was a promise that he should have any woman he looked upon with desire. She then recommended the most desirable, a Spartan queen named Helen, who the goddess said was the mortal most resembling herself. In fact, Helen was by way of being a relative, for she had been born of Leda, who had been loved by Zeus, disguised as a swan, and so she herself had the radiant stature of the gods, a swan's soft muscularity, and her mother's eyes. Paris straightway gave up being a shepherd and resumed his rank as Prince of Troy. He demanded of his doting father a treasure ship and a piratical crew. Thereupon he sailed to Sparta on a diplomatic mission to King Menelaus, Helen's husband. Paris and Helen met at a state banquet. By dawn, she was aboard his ship, and it was sailing for Troy. Now, Helen had been courted by all the kings and princes of the Greek islands. Her father had hesitated long before allowing her to accept any suitor. He was afraid that the rejected suitors would band together to destroy the successful one, and himself and his kingdom in the bargain. So Helen flirted with them all, encouraged them all, and accepted none. Finally, Ulysses, who was one of the suitors, offered a plan. All Helen's admirers would swear a mighty oath to refrain from murdering the successful suitor and would join to defend Helen and her husband, whoever he might be, against any attack. Thereupon Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, most powerful of the Greek chieftains. Thus it was that when Paris made off with Helen, 1,000 kings were summoned to keep their oath. They assembled a huge fleet and sailed for Troy. The Greeks camped outside the walls of Troy and for 10 years tried to fight their way into the city, but the walls were strong and the Trojans brave. The defenders were led by King Priam's 50 warrior sons, the great Hector, who was their chief, and even after Hector was killed by the Greek hero Achilles, the Trojans refused to be defeated, until they were tricked into defeating themselves. The author of that fatal trick was Ulysses, sharpest tactician among the invaders. The Greeks pretended to lift their siege. They struck their tents, boarded their ships, and sailed around a headland out of sight, where they anchored and waited until nightfall. Behind them on the beach, they had left a giant wooden horse. The Trojans reacted just as Ulysses had calculated. They began to celebrate and quickly lost their wits. They thought the wooden horse an offering to Poseidon, god of the sea, and dragged it through the gates into the city, so as to anger Poseidon against the Greeks and spoil their voyage home. But the wooden horse was hollow and so artfully made that Ulysses and a company of armed warriors were able to hide inside and remain undetected as the horse was rolled into the city. That night, as Troy slept, the Greeks crawled out of their hiding place, killed the Trojan sentries, and opened the gates to the Greek army, which had sailed back in the darkness. It was a complete surprise. Troy was taken, its fighting men slaughtered, its women and children enslaved. Then Ulysses sailed for home. His 3 ships loaded with booty, but victory never comes cheap. Poseidon's anger had indeed been kindled. He roused the winds and tides against Ulysses and sent word to island ogres and monsters of the deep. And for 10 long years, the great voyager had to battle his way through the worst perils that the imagination of an offended god could devise. This is the story of that voyage. All right, you guys, I think we need to break that down a little bit. For those of us that already watched the videos that I attached in the earlier blog post, you're probably thinking, yep, I'm good, especially if you are a lover of Greek mythology. If you are kind of like me and not super geeky into Greek mythology, you might be thinking, what did she just read? So we'll break down the basics here. Essentially what you need to know is that before our book, there was a wedding between some gods and goddesses. And pretty much everyone was invited except for one goddess. She got left off the invite list. Now, the one goddess, Eris, is not going to just sit around and be like, cool, I'm not invited, totally fine. Instead, she's going to still come to the wedding, but she's not just going to crash it and eat cake. She's going to cause some trouble while she's there. So she brings an apple, and on her apple it says, to the fairest. And then she presents it to 3 goddesses who are attending the wedding. Now, of course, Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera all want the apple. Because as we've seen in other stories like Snow White, if something says to the fairest, they're going to want it. Now, they all come up with plans on how to make sure that they're the ones that get the golden apple. But unfortunately, the gods are not that dumb, and they're not going to pick who gets the apple. Instead, they're going to pick some random mortal kid, Paris, who lives in the city of Troy. okay? And I'll make sure I include a map in the post so that you can see that Troy and Greece kind of close, but there's like, you know, the Mediterranean Sea in between the two places, so it's a bit of a journey to get there. So anyways, we have this Prince of Troy who's actually hanging out as a shepherd boy. We don't really know why, but there's obviously more to that story. And they ask him to come and make the decision of who should get the apple. Okay, the three goddesses all present him with something, but the winner is gonna be Aphrodite, because she pretty much promises that this prince, shepherd boy living in Troy gets to marry whoever he wants, okay? So he's like, cool, that sounds like a good deal. And then Aphrodite also is going to even suggest who he should marry. He is going to get suggested Helen. Now, Helen may be an awesome wife and all, but the problem is she's already someone's wife. That's a problem. In fact, Helen is the queen of Sparta, and she's already married to the king of Sparta. Now, the Prince of Troy doesn't care that she's already married because she was promised to, let's back that up. So the only problem with Helen is she's a queen of Sparta, meaning she's married to the king of Sparta. But to Paris, who lives in Troy, that doesn't seem to be a problem because this agreement has already been all figured out with the goddess Aphrodite. So Paris goes to Sparta, picks up Helen, and because of whatever magical spell that Aphrodite has placed, Helen goes with Paris back to the city of Troy, and they live happily ever after. Kind of. However, what you need to know is before Helen got married to the king of Sparta, she was wanted by all the Greek kings and princes, and her dad was not dumb. He realized that it could be a problem if she said yes to one Greek suitor, that the other ones might cause some problems. So this is where our character Ulysses comes in for the very first time in the prologue. He's the one that makes the plan that pretty much says Helen gets to pick whoever she wants to marry. Okay, remember she's the mortal queen of Sparta. Helen is going to get to marry whichever Greek dude she wants. Okay, and the agreement that Ulysses comes up with is whoever she chooses was clearly the best man, and all the other Greek princes and kings are going to essentially support that marriage, and if anything ever happens to her, they will go to war for her. Guess what? Something happened to her. She essentially gets taken away by Paris, and then all of the Greek kings and princes and all their warriors follow after. So this is how you get the Greeks sailing up to Troy, and this is how you get the Greeks standing outside the Trojan wall for 10 years trying to get in. The city of Troy has a major wall, and it cannot be penetrated easily. So then after 10 years of being like, oh, this is not going well, Ulysses comes in again with another great trick. This is where the great Trojan horse story comes from. It's originally from the Iliad, okay? And that's the part that we're hearing about in the Odyssey. So Ulysses realizes that if they trick the Trojans to let them in the city, that then they can be victorious. They build a big old wooden horse, big enough for Ulysses and some of his men to climb inside and hide, and then they essentially offer it as a gift. Now, in ancient times, we know that gifts were a big deal, especially gifts to the gods, because they believed that everything in their world was going to be directly impacted by the gods. So what happens is the Trojans wake up one day and all of a sudden the Greek soldiers aren't outside their city, and they see a giant wooden horse, and they think that the Greeks have gone home, and that they left the giant wooden horse on the beach as a gift for Poseidon because Poseidon has a thing for horses. And you would leave a gift for Poseidon on the beach because Poseidon's going to either let your ships get home nice and safely, or as god of the ocean, is going to sink them to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, which they don't want. So that's what happens. They leave the horse. The Trojans fall for the trick. They open up their gates. They roll in the giant horse because now they're trying to mess with the Greeks and try to have Poseidon get mad at them. So they roll the horse inside of the city of Troy. They celebrate the fact that they've won a 10-year battle, which would be something to celebrate. They party, they have good fun, and they fall asleep. As soon as the Greeks realize that the Trojans have all fallen asleep and ended their party, they sneak out, they start killing people, essentially sack the city, and win the Trojan War, which may or may not have happened, but that doesn't really matter. It's just a part of our story. So, what happens next? Ulysses has now come up with the plan that has won the Trojan War, and his head is getting a little bit bigger by the day. Not literally, but figuratively, bigger by the day. He has what we call hubris. This is a Greek idea of essentially big-headed syndrome. We think we are awesome. We think we are the best. We think that we don't really need the gods on our side. So essentially Ulysses is going to make Poseidon mad, and Poseidon is going to get all of his buddies on his side and will cause a very, very long 10-year journey home for Ulysses and his men. Spoiler alert, a lot of people are gonna die. But Ulysses will go on a 10-year journey, and that is our book. So, I hope that helped. That may have made it more confusing. Maybe reread the prologue, maybe rewatch those videos I shared, maybe rewatch this video altogether. Let's get ready to read Ships and Men, the first chapter in the Adventures of Ulysses.